I want to give a brief introduction to the idea of natural selection. The idea come up with by Darwin and Wallace in the 1860s. In a way, it's a pretty simple concept. I'm surprised somebody didn't come up with it sooner. Well, it's an easy concept, but not so easy if you're the ones being selected. And the process works a lot like it sounds. Nature selects. It looks at the variety of organisms in a population, like this school of fish, and starts selecting. And it's not real kind. It says, you're going the wrong way. You're dead. You're a little too tilted. You're a little too small. You're a little too long. And so on. And just keep selecting and whittling down the population. But first, a little background on what it was that Darwin and Wallace saw that made them come up with this idea in the first place. Both Darwin and Wallace came from England, but it was their travels around the world that really influenced them heavily. So you can see Darwin's map of his journey around the world, which he took on the HMS Beagle. Can you imagine going around the world on a ship like that? Crazy. But he saw lots of different places, visited a lot of biodiversity hotspots around the world. In particular, the Galapagos Islands seem to have been one of those important stops. And both men visited quite a few islands. So Wallace, in addition to hanging around in the Amazon basin, also spent a fair bit of time over here in the Philippines, in Papua New Guinea, places in that region. Islands seem to be this real kind of biodiversity hotspot and evolutionary crucible in a way that just caused species to diversify, it seems. And so those were pretty influential places. Both men, as they traveled around, saw a huge diversity of life. They saw the struggle for existence. They were able to see fossils and just things that you wouldn't normally run into in England. They also had other influences. Concentrate on some of Darwin's. We talked in a previous video about Charles Lyell and George Cuvier, who talked about extinctions of species. Darwin also read a work by Lamarck, who was a French thinker that came up with this idea of inheritance of acquired characteristics. So he was bothered by the idea of extinction, and to resolve that, kind of basically came up with his own theory about how evolution worked. And it was the idea of use and disuse. So the classic example is the giraffe, which uses its neck to get up to these upper branches to be able to get enough food. And as it uses it, the neck grows and it passes that on to the next generation. We know this is not the way inheritance works. Gregor Mendel, working about the same time as Darwin and Wallace, actually came up with a better theory about this, but it was an idea that was kind of close enough that individuals did pass on traits to the next generation. One final thinker, Thomas Malthus, who was a theologian and economist, said that populations, so in his essay on populations, he said populations would increase exponentially if it weren't for a few things: food, disease, and war. They always seem to limit populations, so instead of exploding, these populations would stay kind of low. Really keyed on the idea of the struggle for existence. Life is hard, and not everybody makes it. Key influences on both Darwin and Wallace. So now we come to the theory itself, and this is a brief summary of both Darwin and Wallace's theory. We start with a population, not a species, but just a population. A bunch of individuals. Think of a forest, just a patch of trees of the same species, all interbreeding. So that's our starting point. How would that change? Because natural selection explains how populations change over time. So first of all, there is variation within that population. Kind of like I showed with the fish. Some were long, some were short, some were small, some were big. Variation within that population. They passed on traits to the next generation. Again, this is where Lamarck comes in. You pass on the traits that you have. But not everybody does, because they either fail to reproduce or just die in the normal course of life. Life is hard, and
most species out there don't live very long. Now, these three observations by themselves are fairly obvious things, but it's putting them together that really makes this theory powerful. And here we look at over time, because of all these things happening over time, favorable traits accumulate. So let's go back to that variation. So because species vary, but many of them end up dying off or not reproducing, then it's the favorable traits, the good ones, the ones that fit that environment the best, that accumulate over time. So a species becomes, I guess you could think of it as better and better, but really more appropriately, it becomes better suited to that environment because the weak ones have not passed on their genes. So that's the theory in a nutshell. Nothing incredibly complicated, but a powerful theory.
Although Darwin and Wallace really share credit for the sort of idea of natural selection put out there for everyone to see, Darwin gets more of the credit. It's because of this thing, On the Origin of Species. This is a big book and actually a really good read. He gave a huge amount of evidence for the idea of species changing over time. In fact, the full title is The Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Existence. And that was one thing that I think both men really understood well, the struggle for existence. Life is tough. We're really fortunate living in the Western world in the 21st century, right? But if you're any other species or even people living at different times or places, your chances of being selected against by nature are quite a bit higher. And so that struggle can create new species over time. And that's what Darwin was theorizing. But in the context of our class, I want to really talk more about and focus on the idea that this selection process results in a stronger species. That this population of fish don't necessarily become new species, but they become better suited for the pond that they're living in.
There are many examples that demonstrate natural selection. It's been observed happening quite a few times, but the peppered moth is a classic example. We start with these two varieties of the moth, light form and a dark form. Pretty simple. We also need to take into account, that's kind of the genetics, but their environment. So here's dark moth on a tree trunk in the forest, and the light-colored moth. Obviously, the light-colored moth is better camouflaged than the dark one. And that sets us up for understanding the change over time. So in 1848, a lot of people were out looking around the woods, cataloging biodiversity, and found this new thing, the dark-colored moth. At that time, the tree trunks were pretty light-colored. So there's a lot of lichens on them, and that made the light-colored version really camouflage better, which meant it was abundant. So this thing, the dark one, was kind of brand new. People were excited about that. But there's hardly any of them. These numbers are just a generic estimate, so probably even less than 0.01%. All right, well, going through time, because remember, natural selection takes place over time. In 1900, we'd had the Industrial Revolution, and that made the tree trunks much darker colored. They got covered with soot and killed off the lichens, and so the environment had changed. And now, the light-colored version had gone from 99% down to 2%, and the dark version had gone way up to dominate the population. Why? Because it had an advantage, and the light-colored ones died off. There is an example of natural selection and evolution in action. We didn't get any new species, but we did get change over time. People went back and looked in 1959, just to continue the story a little bit. Trees were still dark, but those had increased a little bit. Maybe the dark versions decreased a little bit. But by 1993, people had really gotten their act together and cleaned up the air. The tree trunks went back to this lighter coloration, and then we had a lot more light-colored versions and quite a bit fewer dark-colored versions. And so here's the species adjusting to the environment and surviving based on different characteristics and different success rates.
Although Darwin contemplated how natural selection could, over millennia, have resulted in all the species that we see on Earth today, it can also be applied on a much smaller scale, just to individual populations and how the environment shapes them and makes them stronger. Kind of that idea of survival of the fittest, right? From my experience, when I was doing field work in Arizona, there's this one rancher who just hated rattlesnakes. And the closer I got to their ranch, the more rattlesnakes I saw that just didn't rattle. Even when you poke them with a stick, they'd barely even shake their tail. But the further away you got, the rattlesnakes, anytime you got anywhere near, they would rattle and give you a warning. Why is that? Well, my hypothesis is that they were pretty vigilant about the rattlesnakes in their area, and if they saw one, or more likely heard one, they'd kill it. And so they were doing the same selecting process, resulting in a different environment around their ranch that resulted in a different behavior of rattlesnakes. Now, it didn't change any new species, but it's a pretty powerful example about how these selecting events can really shape a species.
Well, one more look at this from sort of a conceptual framework. Any individual is the result of a couple of things: the genetics they inherited and the environment they live in. So that should sound pretty familiar. That individual, based on both of those things, is going to live or die, or even just fail to reproduce. So here you do not pass on any genes to the next generation. Here you can, so you pass on those genetics. And so the individuals of the next generation look more like the ones that lived. And this cycle repeats again and again, generation after generation, accumulating traits that work best in this particular environment.
So the idea of natural selection provides a really important framework for thinking about life itself, for understanding the world around us and other species and how the environment has shaped them. But it also helps us understand ourselves as well. Why do people have different blood types? Why do some people develop certain diseases like sickle cell anemia? Why do we get scared of snakes? A lot of these questions have roots in our ancestry, the environments we grew up in, and help us understand a little bit more about why we are the way we are. I hope this helps you appreciate life in a deeper and longer sense. Even though most of our focus is on how cells work, there's a lot of answers that natural selection can provide about those questions as well. Until next time, keep appreciating life.